So today we have 3 student lectures. Unfortunately, you will see on the program that there are actually 4 names. Unfortunately, Chao Wang could not make it, so we'll just have three talks this afternoon. And so the first talk that we're going to hear from is from Christina Lee. Christina is a PhD candidate advised by Matt Cannon, and we heard from Matt earlier in the conference, and she's in the Department of Chemistry at Stanford University. She received a BA in Chemical and Physical Biology from Harvard University and is now here at Stanford. And so Christina will talk on CO2 and CO reduction on oxide-derived copper.
Thanks, Rich, for the introduction. It's a tough act to follow, Tom Friedman. So unfortunately, I don't have anything profound to say about the world, but I hope to share with you some of our work on electrocatalysis to generate liquid fuels from CO2 and CO. So the main goal of our lab has been to implement a CO2 recycling scheme. So we heard a lot about CO2 emissions and the possibility of doing CO2 capture and sequestration. What we'd like to do is, rather than pump the CO2 into the ground, is actually just convert it back to a fuel and create a closed cycle for CO2 such that we can constantly reuse it and not emit it into the atmosphere. And so the scheme that we imagine is shown here on this slide. We can input renewable energy to convert the CO2 to some form of liquid fuel. And at the same time, we'll be converting water to oxygen. And then that liquid fuel can just be fed directly into a car, it can be fed into a fuel cell, and then we can get renewable energy back out again. Specifically, we're looking at an electrochemical process, and so I've showed a range of products here that we can generate from CO2, and those include molecules like CO and formate, but also molecules like ethanol, which are already known fueled products. And so the reactions at the cathode and the anode, which are the reactions that we're interested in, are shown down here. And for example, at the cathode, we can do 2 electron and 2 proton reduction of CO2 to generate CO and water. And at the anode, we'll be doing water oxidation. So there are some key challenges in CO2 reduction and some key metrics that I'll be referring to throughout my talk, so I just want to introduce those metrics to you now. The first is, again, these 2 reactions at the cathode and at the anode that I mentioned. And this determines the amount of energy that we can store in the form of fuel. Unfortunately, we can only store that much energy if we have perfect catalysts that can operate at the thermodynamic minimum. Generally speaking, we need to apply a certain amount of overpotential. And so overpotential is a really crucial metric, and we want to keep that overpotential as low as possible so that we have the highest energetic efficiency. The other main issue is a selectivity issue. So we're doing all of these electrolyses in water, and water reduction, it turns out, is right around the same energy as CO2 reduction, and it's also a kinetically quite facile reaction. And so whenever we do CO2 reduction, we almost certainly also see hydrogen, and so that's a reaction that we're trying to minimize when we design our catalysts. So to summarize, we're trying to get the best activity out of our catalysts, and that includes overpotential as well as current density. We're trying to get good selectivity of our CO2 reduction products over hydrogen, and we're also aiming for good stability so that we can run these electrolyzers for a long time. Some of the work that's been done on CO2 was done in the mid-'80s to early '90s by a Japanese chemist, and a lot of that focus was on polycrystalline copper. So copper is kind of a special material. It's capable of making a lot of different products. All of them are shown here, and those products include hydrocarbons like methane and ethylene. However, copper also has quite a lot of issues in terms of its stability and its activity, and I just want to highlight here some of the reasons that we're working on copper is to try to improve these deficiencies. So the first is, on this plot, we have the potential versus a scale that we call RHE. 0 is where the thermodynamic minimum is at, and then we have efficiency for a variety of different products. So at low potential, you can see that all we're making is hydrogen. That's the product we don't want. However, as you ramp up the potential, the hydrogen starts to go down, and we start to see some of these other products, including CO and formate, and then you ramp up the potential a little bit more, and you see ethylene and methane, which are our target products. So what we sought to do was to improve the performance of copper by lowering that overpotential towards the products that we want by making nanostructured materials. And so our synthetic method is very, very simple. We start with that bulk copper foil, whose activity I just showed. We oxidize it up in air, and it forms this copper oxide material. So you can see these rods, and then by XRD, we see that it is, in fact, copper oxide. And then we do an electroreduction, and we reform copper zero, but our copper zero is now very different from the copper zero we started with. You can see in this SEM image that it's composed of very small particles that are aggregated together into these sort of larger structures. And we can, in fact, confirm that the copper oxide has been completely removed and copper zero remains. So I'm going to show you here sort of our typical data that we get out of CO2 reduction electrolyses. So plotted here is a bulk electrolysis that was run at minus 0.5 volts versus RHE, so we're talking about 500 millivolts of overpotential in a saturated bicarbonate electrolyte, so water with bicarbonate. And we're running this over about a 6-hour period to test for sort of nominal stability. And we have current density on this left-hand axis and the efficiency for CO, so CO2 to CO on the right-hand axis. So polycrystalline copper, that foil that I showed you, is our sort of comparison sample. And you can see that the current density overall is very, very low at this potential. So we're at low overpotential. Polycrystalline copper just can't do a whole lot. The efficiency for CO2 reduction is also very poor. We get about 10% CO that drops down quite quickly. We get 3% formate, and we get nothing else. Now if we put oxide-derived copper into that mix, we see that immediately the current density jumps up by a lot. So initially we see a very high current density. That's due to the copper oxide reduction to copper zero. And then once that stabilizes, we get CO2 reduction at 30 to 40% CO production and 33% formate production. So we've improved the activity of copper from about 10 total percent CO2 reduction to 70% total CO2 reduction. We can then compare over the whole range of overpotential, so similar to the plot I showed earlier, and I've just replotted the data for the polycrystalline copper that I showed. And if we put the oxide-derived copper onto the same plot, you can see that the overpotential for peak formation of CO and formate has shifted to the left by 400 to 500 millivolts. So we're now able to do the same reactions with higher efficiency at significantly lower applied energies. We're obviously interested in these more reduced products as well, so the hydrocarbons. And on oxide-derived copper, we don't see any methane, which was the dominant product on polycrystalline copper. We see ethylene and ethane. So we see only these C2 products. So in our case, the CC coupling is happening very quickly. We wanted to understand a little bit more from a kinetic perspective about what was going on in our system. And so we made what we call a TOEFL plot. And this is simply the data that I showed earlier, but now I've put the partial current density for CO2 reduction on the left-hand axis, and potential is on the bottom axis. And so I plotted oxide-derived copper in red and polycrystalline copper in black. And as we expected, oxide-derived copper has significantly higher current density for CO2 reduction. So that was pretty obvious from the previous plot. But what we did next is we did a surface area correction, because we know also oxide-derived copper is nanostructured, it has high surface area. And it turns out that when you do the surface area correction, these two plots now fall on the same line. So it turns out that oxide-derived copper's absolute ability to reduce CO2 is quite similar to that of polycrystalline copper. So that raised the question, what is the origin of this enhanced selectivity? How are we getting good Faradaic efficiency? And it turns out that the reason we have good Faradaic efficiency is because oxide-derived copper just doesn't do hydrogen evolution very well. So again, I've made the same plot, but now this is partial current for hydrogen evolution. We do the surface area correction, and you can see that I have a 35 times suppression of hydrogen evolution at low overpotential on oxide-derived copper. So really, the origin of this high Faradaic efficiency that we observed is due to hydrogen suppression rather than enhancement of CO2 reduction. So the obvious question here was, are the nanoparticles important? Are we simply just making nanoparticles, and nanoparticles can do things very differently than sort of a bulk copper foil? So we did a comparison to commercial nanoparticles that are more or less the same crystallite size as oxide-derived copper. And the answer is no, nanoparticles are not the same as oxide-derived copper. when we run these commercial nanoparticles, they do basically nothing. They make less than 5% CO2 reduction products, and they have high current density. So really, it's just pumping out a ton of hydrogen. So copper nanoparticles are not sufficient to reduce CO2. So far, I've told you about CO2 reduction to CO and formate, which were the two most accessible products. They're 2 electron, 2 proton reduction products. And what I'd like to tell you about now is the formation of some of these more reduced products, products that we can actually consider as liquid fuel type molecules. And so when we looked at oxide-derived copper at these somewhat higher overpotentials, we noticed that there was, in fact, formation of some of these products, ethanol, acetate, and propanol. And in fact, there is a shift in the overpotential to lower overpotential relative to polycrystalline copper. So that gave us some hope that we would be able to access these liquid fuel type molecules. We also knew, based on previous work, that CO is the key intermediate towards the formation of these more reduced products. And so we wanted to ask the question, what would happen if we fed CO directly to our electrolysis? And if we had a greater CO concentration, would we be able to access these more reduced products in higher yield? And so we proposed this sort of 2-step process to the formation of ethanol and acetate, where CO2 is first reduced to CO. It could be by a different catalyst, and then we feed CO to our catalyst to engage this more challenging transformation of 8 electrons and 8 protons to make ethanol. So that's in fact what we did. We did electrolyses now in 0.1 molar KOH, and we just saturate it with CO gas. And I'm using these same copper nanoparticles as our comparison sample because it's a high surface area, sort of bulk copper type material. And you can see on copper nanoparticles that really it doesn't touch CO at all. So here again, I've shown the potential on the bottom axis and Faradaic efficiency up here. And overall, there's less than 10% total efficiency for CO reduction. Everything else is hydrogen. It does make a range of products. So we see in gray, we see some acetate at the lower overpotentials. We get ethanol formation as we ramp up, and then we get a little bit of ethylene and ethane. We put oxide-derived copper under the same conditions, and there's a dramatic increase in the CO reduction efficiency. So you can see at these lower overpotentials, we can get 50 to 60% production of CO reduction products. The primary products in all cases is ethanol and acetate. And for our best conditions, we can get about 40% Faradaic efficiency for ethanol at minus 0.3 volts. And so that's quite a low overpotential for the production of a liquid fuel from CO. We did the same analysis where we wanted to understand, is it hydrogen suppression, is it CO activation? And so here I've plotted the surface area normalized data for the CO reduction partial current density. And in this case, we actually see an absolute activation of CO. So there's a 22 times enhancement of CO reduction efficiency, or CO reduction total current density relative to these nanoparticles. If we do, so there was supposed to be a plot here that shows that there's a little bit of hydrogen suppression, but not a lot. I'm not sure where it went. Okay, so then we wanted to interrogate the mechanism a little bit further by looking at the slope of the Toffel plot. So in electrochemistry, the slope can tell us something about the rate determining step. And this 113 millivolt per decade Toffel slope indicates that we have a rate determining 1 electron reduction. And that 1 electron reduction can take a number of forms. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we hypothesize that it could either be an electron coupled with a proton transfer or an electron coupled with another CO coupling to form that CC bond. We then believe that ethanol and acetate come from a common intermediate, which could be this allene type surface bound intermediate. And then the bifurcation of this intermediate is hydroxide dependent. So what we showed then was if we increase the concentration of hydroxide in the system, we can actually totally favor the formation of acetate along this bottom pathway. And you can see here at minus 0.2 volts that we have all acetate formation in the higher hydroxide content electrolyte. So lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about structural characterization. So we wanted to know, it's not nanoparticles, what is the structure that's giving us high efficiency for CO2 and CO reduction? And so we turned to TEM imaging as a way to look in more detail at the structure. And the first thing we noticed was that oxide-derived coppers consisted of these sort of highly interconnected nanocrystallites, whereas these nanoparticles are simply particles that are sitting on top of each other and are relatively mobile relative to each other. And so when you look at the grain boundaries here in oxide-derived copper, you see a very structured grain boundary, and you see sort of two grains that are misoriented relative to each other and also unable to rotate relative to each other. And so we feel that grain boundaries are a type of high-energy bulk defect, and it could be a location where the binding of adsorbates and the catalysis of adsorbates is highly activated. So the last thing I'll show is just some preliminary data that we have on analyzing these grain boundaries in a more quantitative way. And so we do orientation mapping using TEM electron diffraction. And here I've just plotted the orientations of a representative sample of oxide-derived copper. We can then generate these grain boundary maps based on the orientation. And then we can get quantitative statistics on the types of orientations that we have, the angles of misorientation. And so we're now working up this data and trying to collect sort of a statistical amount of data to really say for sure, is the grain boundary an important aspect of this catalysis? And the one sort of interesting thing that we've observed so far is that there's a very high density of a special type of boundary called a twin boundary in our materials that is not present in this just like randomly statistically oriented grain boundary distribution. So in summary, we've shown that we can do this two-step processing to make ethanol from CO2. We've identified possibly an interesting surface site at grain boundaries for this CO2 reduction reaction. And we've also seen that suppression of hydrogen evolution is a really important mechanism for catalyzing CO2 reduction with high efficiency. So in the future, we have a lot, I guess I'm pretty out of time, but we have a lot of really exciting stuff going on in our lab where we're trying to characterize the CO binding strength, we're trying to characterize the structure, and we're also trying to synthesize new materials sort of based on some of these principles to try to get even better catalysts and to optimize different pathways for CO2 reduction. So I'd like to thank my advisor who is here, as well as all of my lab mates who have worked with me on this project, and then all of the collaborators that helped us with the TEM work, as well as some other in situ studies that we're doing. And of course, the funding, including GCEP, for this project. I'm happy to take any questions.
So I'm not quite clear on what the pH of your solution is. So what is the form of the CO2 in solution? Is it really bicarbonate or something?
So for CO2 reduction, we run everything at pH 7. And so CO2 is dissolved. So there is CO2 in the form of bicarbonate, but there is also about 30 millimolar dissolved CO2 in the solution. And so we think that we're acting on that 30 millimolar dissolved CO2, not on the bicarbonate directly.
When you added the OH, you could be changing the reactants, the reactive form.
Right, so in the hydroxide case, there is no CO2 in the system. That is only feeding CO directly. So we do maintain the pH 13 of 0.1 molar KOH, and we're acting on the dissolved CO in that case.
I was wondering if you could explain more about what these twin boundaries and if you have any hypotheses of why that just like changes the behavior of your surface so much.
So I guess it's known that sort of grain boundary surfaces, so grain boundaries are bulk defects, but when they interact with the surface, you can get a very different structure sort of locally at the grain boundary. And so it's actually been observed by TEM that normally you have FCC copper, but at the sort of intersection of two grains, you can end up having like an HCP type structure where it's just like totally randomly oriented. So we think that sort of just accessing these totally different lattice parameters in the vicinity of the grain boundary can activate CO binding, for example. And that's something we're trying to study more now.
Okay, our second student speaker today is Chris McLennan. He's from the University of Dundee in Scotland. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the laboratory of Claire Halpin in the Division of Plant Sciences there. And he received his BS in biochemistry and molecular biology from Penn State University in 2003. And then his PhD he received in cell biology and molecular genetics from the University of Maryland in 2009, where he studied how plants sense the phytohormone ethylene. So Chris, welcome, and he will be speaking on using plants for biofuel production.
All right, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give a talk here today. This is way far. There we go. So, like Richard said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the laboratory of Claire Halpin, where we're looking at using plants or improving plants for making biofuels. So why are we interested in using plants to improve biofuel production? Well, they can take out part of they use CO2 in photosynthesis, so by growing them and using them as fuel, we're partially mitigating the effects of burning that fuel. Now, the problem currently is that currently most biofuels being used are first-generation biofuels. I think, in fact, I have a statistic from 2012 which stated that almost 40% of the US maize crop is going into fuel production. Now, this has obvious effects on food prices and things like that. So what we're looking at is moving this along into second-generation biofuel production, which is using glucose locked up in the plant cell wall and using this to make our fuels. Now, this has just started. I think they're now in limited initial production of making cellulosic ethanol. And the reason for this, that is just getting started, is that the process of saccharification, breaking down the cellulose into its glucose units, is very difficult because cellulose is bound up and interconnected with other plant cell wall polymers, including hemicellulose, and what we're interested in, lignin. So this is just, on the right is a simplified diagram of the biochemical pathway to synthesize lignin from its precursor phenylalanine. I just want to point out a few things from this pathway. If you listen to Clint Chappell's talk earlier, you'll know that lignin monomers come in 3 different flavors, H, G, and S lignin. And also a few of the enzymes that I'll be dealing with, CCR, CSC, and C4H, just to know that these are some enzymes that help catalyze the formation of these lignin monomers. So we're actually using a plant called Arabidopsis thaliana. Now, we don't use this as an ultimate end product for biofuel production because it's fairly small, but it is a good genetic model system. It has great established genomic and genetic research tools. It has a sequenced and well-annotated genome, and it also has a fairly rapid life cycle and and prolific reproduction that allows for easier study, with the hope that whatever we learn in Arabidopsis we'll be able to transfer into useful biofuel crop plants. Now we're taking I'll talk about 2 strategies that we've used to try to make these plants more amenable for biofuel production. So first, I'll talk about a little bit about what we've done with some co-expression analysis, which is basically looking at a plant under many different conditions, as many conditions as you can get, and looking at the genes and which ones are expressed together, with the hope that by looking at the genes that are expressed together, you should be able to find ones that have a common process. And the second is mutant screening, which is basically mutating a plant and looking for a specific trait that you're interested in. And in this case, we're hoping for increased saccharification. So I'll go back to the code. I'll just start off with co-expression analysis. So what we did was, with the co-expression analysis, we looked at the expression of several different lignin genes. And I should mention this is in collaboration with our collaborators at the University of Ghent, Borjan's lab, and at the University of Wisconsin, John Ralph's lab. So just go back to the point that we looked at the expression of several different lignin biosynthetic genes under all these different conditions and looked at what genes came out as being expressed together with these lignin biosynthetic genes. And one that popped out, along with several other lignin biosynthetic genes, one that popped out that wasn't really known to us was this gene that we term CSE. Now, since our labs tend to look at lignin, the first thing we did was to check to see if the lignin levels were altered in a mutant of this CSE gene. And it turns out lignin content is reduced. On the left graph here, you can see the wild type, or our normal plant, has a certain level of lignin, but our CSE mutant has a reduced level of lignin. And also, not only does it have reduced lignin content, its structure is altered. So a different type of lignin is being made using two different assays of measuring the different lignin monomers. We see that in the CSE mutant, the H units represented by the red bar are increased in the wild type, are increased over the wild type. So that suggests to us that not only is the lignin content reduced, but its structure has been altered as well. So altering the lignin is nice because we study lignin, but it would be more interesting to us and for the GCEP project is if saccharification was affected, since greater saccharification equals more sugar, which equals more biofuel. So when we tested the mutant for saccharification, we find that yes, its saccharification is increased. So the mutant, the CSE mutant here is represented by the red line, and you can see that compared to the black line, which is the wild type or the background plant or the normal plant, that we're getting almost 4 times as much sugar under these conditions than the normal wild type plant. So it suggests to us that the CSE gene could be a target for improving crop plants for biofuel production. And we're actually currently working towards applying this towards crop plants. So by basically studying the gene sequences, we have identified a copy of the CSE gene in several crop plants, such as rice. It's present in switchgrass and poplar as well. And just as an initial indication of whether this gene would have the same effect in the crop plants as it would in Arabidopsis, we did a simple experiment where we took a regular rice CSE gene and transformed it into our Arabidopsis CSE mutant to see if that would rescue it. And when we do that, you can see this is just a simple growth assay. Since our CSE mutant has a slight growth defect, when we transform it with the rice copy, we get restoration of the wild type growth. So that indicates to us that the rice CSE gene can perform the same function as the Arabidopsis gene, which would then indicate that if we did the same thing in rice, we might be able to get the same effects. So I'll just transition quickly into the other method that I was speaking of, which is mutagenic screens. So I've actually performed 2 mutagenic screens. The first one I'll talk to you is an enhancer screen. So we took a lignin biosynthetic mutant, termed BREF3-3. You listened to Clint Chappell's lab or talk, you should know that this is a mutant in one of the lignin biosynthetic genes. Now, it's not a severe mutant. It has virtually no growth defects, but it does have a slight decrease in lignin and a slight increase in saccharification. But what we're looking for is an even greater increase in saccharification. So we mutagenize these plants, and by using a high throughput saccharification screen developed by collaborators at University of York, we look for plants that basically give us more sugar than the background Ref3-3 mutant. And when we identify those mutants, we can go back to the progeny and hopefully characterize it further. So this is just a graph of our saccharification. WT is wild type or a normal plant. And then the background mutant, the Ref3-3 mutant, you can see has improved saccharification. But we also identified several mutants. Actually, most turned out to be alleles or basically versions of the same gene that's been mutated that have an even greater increase in saccharification. In fact, you can see here that we're almost getting 100% conversion of the cellulose in these plants into glucose. Now, this is not necessarily a trivial thing because anecdotally, when you cross two separate saccharification improving mutants, you don't necessarily get an additive increase in the saccharification itself. So this seems to indicate to us that this mutant could be especially important in improving the saccharification of plants. Now, like I said, we're a lignin lab, so we're interested in the lignin content of these plants, and we asked the question on whether this improvement in saccharification was also due to a reduction in lignin. So we did some lignin assays, and in the graph on the top is just a graph of the lignin content of these plants. And you can see that in our mutants, our lignin content is reduced even more over the background mutant. So also, when we do staining for lignin in some stem sections from these plants, that the background mutant still has some lignin content, as you can see by the pink color, but our double mutant has an even greater increase in greater decrease in the lignin. So that seems to indicate to us that our saccharification increases are due to lignin decreases. Currently, we're working on trying to get these genes, or altering these genes in some crop plants to see if we can get the same effects. Just quickly, I'll go on to our second screen, which is it's similar process, but a different question. So in this case, we're also looking at a background mutant. In the top left plant there, we have another lignin mutant, has great increases in saccharification, but it's also dwarfed because of this mutation. Now, that doesn't really help us because if we want more sugar out of these plants, reducing the size of the plants isn't helping us. So we mutated these plants and just did a simple visual screen looking for plants that have rescued size. It's the case of identifying these mutants, going back to their seeds, and hopefully identifying those mutants even further. Now, when we screened these plants, we were hoping to find several different mutants, and what was interesting is that we found basically two different types of plants. A lot of mutants are like the ones on the left here, where the size is fully rescued back to the wild type size. But we also found a few mutants like those on the right here, where it's intermediate in between our mutant and the original wild type plant. So now, it wouldn't be helpful if we just reverted if we reverted the size back to our wild type, but we lost the gains in the saccharification. So we performed saccharification on these mutants, and you can see here, this is our wild type plant. Our background CCR1-3 mutant, this lignin mutant that we use for the screen, has increased saccharification. And then, just as an example, several mutants still maintain that increase in saccharification. Similarly, let me do this quickly, these mutants also maintain their reductions in lignin content, which seems to indicate that we're not just reverting the phenotype of the plant back to the wild type, we're changing something else that will improve the plant for the, will improve the plant that makes it bigger so we can get more sugar out of these plants. So quickly, I'm over time already. Just as a summary, so using co-expression analysis, we were able to identify CSE as a gene as target for improving plants for biofuel production, because by altering this, we're able to get more sugars out of these plants. And we're also looking at other mutations to hopefully either that we can rescue growth, also with greater improvements in saccharification, with the idea being by generating all these different mutations that we could hopefully combine them to produce plants that have the properties that we want, increase saccharification without harming the plant, without having a size penalty that really is too deleterious for use for this biofuel production. So I'd like to acknowledge GCEP for their funding, everybody in our lab that helped with this project, also our collaborators, Will Borion's lab and John Ralph's lab at the University of Wisconsin collaborated with us on the CSE work. Simon McQueen Mason's lab at the University of York really helped us out with the high throughput saccharification screen. And we'd also like to acknowledge Clint Chappell's lab and Sirius Lee's lab, who are co-collaborators on a new GCEP grant. So thank you. I'll take questions.
So what do you use for the mutagenesis in these?
We use EMS, ethyl methane sulfonate.
And sort of what sort of fraction of the mutations turn out to be something interesting?
Well, fractions of plants is very low. So, I mean, you have to screen thousands and thousands and thousands of plants to find one that you're interested in. That's why these high throughput screening techniques are so useful. Fractions of mutations is quite low as well. Usually, even though we're screening thousands and thousands of plants, each plant that we're screening might have 20 to 30 useful mutations throughout the genome, but they're hitting things that we're not interested in. So it's quite large numbers.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we have our final student speaker, and he is Ian Smith he's a PhD candidate in the chemistry department at Stanford, and he's starting his third year working in Hema Kaunadasa's lab. And Ian, he holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry and mathematics from Cornell, and today he will be talking to us on layered organic, inorganic perovskites as efficient solar cell absorbers.
Thank you for the introduction. So first, I just want to show you a little bit about the background to my research. So this is a chart that is presented by NREL occasionally. And it charts the progress of each technology in solar cell research. So you can match, or so you can watch the efficiency as the years go on. And as you can see, many decades go into a lot of these technologies, in some cases over 30 years. But you can see that for most of them, it's a very steady increase in efficiency increase. However, if you look in the bottom right corner, the yellow dots with the red accent around it are the perovskite solar cells. So these, as you can tell, are very rapidly increasing in efficiency and have only been around for a few years. So that's very exciting, and that's why it's such an exciting field of research to work in. But what are perovskites? So this is a perovskite structure. In this case, we're using lead iodide octahedra. So that's what this lead iodide octahedra. So there's a lead in the center of this octahedron with 6 iodides around it. And each adjacent lead will share 1 iodide, which is the corner of those octahedra. So that's why we share. That's why we say it's corner sharing octahedra. And then this will form a three-dimensional framework in all directions, and it's negatively charged. So to balance that charge, you need a methylammonium cation that resides in the cavity. This material is very nice. It has a very good band gap for solar cells, around 1.6 eV. And it's a direct band gap absorber, which means that it has a very, it absorbs a lot of light for a very small amount of material. So because of that, you can form thin film devices. And so this is an example of an architecture here for a device. However, it's not perfect. There are some concerns that we have to address before we move forward with it. One is the toxicity of the lead, especially for a material that is slightly water soluble. And then the stability of the material, both to light and to moisture. So the light issue, Hema talked about earlier, we could see segregation of iodide in the material, potentially decomposition. We don't really know too much about that right now. The moisture stability, though, is really apparent in the laboratory. If you leave a film out, it'll convert fairly quickly. One other issue, mostly for research purposes, is the consistency of the film formation. Many labs have their own techniques that they report. However, it's really hard to reproduce those. And so if we could come up with a material or a technique for deposition that's easy for everyone to do, that'd be really, really helpful. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce to you a different class or a different type of material that's very related that we call the layered perovskites. And so this here on the left is a very typical example of a layered perovskite. We still call it a perovskite because it's corner-sharing octahedra, in this case of lead iodide octahedra. But because we're adding in larger organic cations, we're separating different layers of that material, so we actually get a layered structure. This, however, is just one of many types of layered perovskites that we like to call the N greater than 1 structures. And so the N value here is essentially counting the number of lead iodide octahedra in each sheet. And so I showed you before the N equals 1. However, the N equals 2 and 3 are shown here as well. And hypothetically, you could get any structure you wanted. In reality, it's pretty hard to get some of the ones with higher N values. But if you take this to the limit, you eventually get out N equals infinity, which is actually just the three-dimensional structure that I talked about before. So these materials, the layered materials, are really nice because you're adding in this organic molecule. And you can imagine adding any functionality you wanted into that material just by using organic chemistry to put anything that fits inside of the structure. So the layered perovskites also tend to have different properties. For example, something very important to solar cells are the band gap and the exciton binding energy of these materials. As you go to smaller N values, you're reducing the dimensionality and therefore reducing the size of that box. And you're increasing the band gap of the material. Also, the exciton binding energy increases. So therefore, when you create a hole and electron pair in the material, it's much harder to separate those and do work using the device. And so we decided to explore the N equals 3 material because this is a nice intermediate between the two extremes. You still get something that approaches the three-dimensional material, hopefully in its electronic and optical properties. However, you still get to use the layered structure with the larger organic molecules, and therefore you can add in any functionality you want into the material in the future. So I was able to synthesize this material shown here. This is a crystal structure that we collected and solved ourselves. It is phenethylammonium, methylammonium, lead iodide, the N equals 3 perovskite. Like I said, it retains a similar structure to the three-dimensional perovskite, and will hopefully then have the same or very similar properties. It is solution processable like the three-dimensional material. However, in this case, it's actually easier to make films out of this material, both because of the layered structure, allowing you to spin the material down on a substrate more easily, but also because you can do it in ambient conditions, which is nice. And after you make the film, it is also more stable to moisture than three-dimensional material, and I'll talk about that later on. But some things to consider, like I said, these layered materials have larger band gaps, which means you're absorbing less of the spectrum. We think this material might actually be better for a tandem device. And then another thing that we hope to address in the future is a possibility of limited carrier transport, mostly in the vertical direction in that figure. You can imagine it might be hard for a carrier to hop from one sheet of lead iodide octahedra down to the next. So making films of this material is very easy. We use a single-step solution spinning step from a 1 molar lead concentration in DMF. Shown here on the left is an SEM of the N=3 material, and it's really hard to see much because it's really flat. But if you try and do the same technique with the 3D perovskite shown there on the right, first of all, you need to anneal it to actually form the material. So that's one step that's extra. But also, even when you do that, there are holes all over the film, which is not good for a thin film device. You can make nice films with a three-dimensional material. However, they are much more difficult. There are a few reported out there that I'll mention briefly here. You can start with a lead iodide film, PBI2. That has to start out like as a very nice film. And then you convert it at high temperatures using methyl ammonium vapor. You can also add a polymer to the solution spinning step. Or even you can do a co-evaporation shown here on the right, which is where you have very high temperature sources of PBI2 and methyl ammonium iodide that in the vapor phase under vacuum will condense on your substrate. If you want to look at any material as an absorber in a solar cell, you need to know the optical properties. There's a few things you can get out of these types of measurements. One is the band gap of the material, or at least an estimate of it. Therefore, you will know where in the solar spectrum it will absorb. But you can also get an idea of the relative energy levels in the material beyond just the band gap. So I'll talk about a little bit about that. In blue on the left is an absorbance spectrum of the three-dimensional perovskite, methyl ammonium lead iodide. That one will absorb around its band gap, around 1.6 eV, and all the energies above that. My material, because it has the higher band gap, does not absorb until higher energies. But interestingly, we're seeing peaks in the spectrum in red there. And on the next slide, I'll talk about what I think is going on. But we've been able to identify these as the N=1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 materials of the layered perovskites. So that was interesting to find there. The photoluminescence shown there on the right is important to know. The blue scan, which is the methyl ammonium lead iodide 3D perovskite, happens where is reported in literature at around 1.6 eV. My material, the photoluminescence occurs at a slightly higher energy, around 1.7. So this is significant because you were getting a higher energy photoluminescence, which is what you would expect from a higher bandgap material. However, this photoluminescence is not actually occurring from the N=3 material in the film. So we think this is actually a lower energy material in the film where all the carriers are collecting there, and then photoluminescence is occurring from that material. We do think it probably still is a layered perovskite, but it's not exactly the layered perovskite that we were searching for. So this is what we think is actually happening during film formation. Once you deposit the film down, we have large domains of N=3 material, the blue octahedra up there. And these are large domains that will diffract X-rays. So we were able to take X-rays of these materials and confirm that it is exclusively by X-ray N=3 crystalline material. However, defect layers of the N=1, 2, 4, and 5, defect layers are in the film. And because they're scattered and randomly distributed throughout the material, you will not see them in the X-ray diffraction because there's not enough unit cells to diffract from. However, they will still have light passing through them, and you will see the optical properties from those layers. Importantly, this material is stable to humidity, both during the deposition but after. So here I've shown a methyl ammonium lead iodide perovskite film that has been exposed to 52% relative humidity over 46 days. And even after 4 days, you see it's starting to convert into PBI2, lead iodide. And after 46 days, it's actually almost fully converted. However, if you take my material and do the same experiment, after 46 days, it's essentially unchanged. This is very important for solar cells, both during the fabrication and after, you can imagine it would be a lot cheaper for a manufacturer to make a solar cell, lineup of roll-to-roll that is under air rather than under nitrogen. And finally, I was able to make devices. So this is essentially copying what's done by some people in the literature. It's essentially a titania compact layer, which is your N-type material, followed by the perovskite, your hole conductor, which is an organic polymer, spirometad, and then gold. And you'll get light to go into the layer of the perovskite. You'll get your hole and electron pair, and then you will extract those into the titania for the electron and the spirometad for the hole. To test these devices, we took IV curves. Essentially what this is you are sweeping the voltage and measuring the current response when you're illuminating the device. So what you want to see, as I've plotted it here, you want to see high voltages, so out to the right, and you want to see high currents, in this case negative currents, so down to the bottom. Importantly, this material has a high VOC, which is where it crosses the x-axis. It's around 1.18 volts. This is a full 100 millivolts higher than a record cell for methyl ammonium light iodide. And in fact, most of those cells will actually be closer to around 1 volt. So this is a higher VOC. We're getting a pretty good JSC. So JSC is the short circuit current, which is at the y-axis. This is essentially a measure of the photocurrent in the device. It's certainly limited when you compare it to the 3D perovskite, but we think it's very good for a first try. And we think that increasing that short circuit current or the photocurrent will allow for better devices in the future. And because of that slightly smaller photocurrent, we are getting an efficiency that's lower than 3D perovskites, just under 5% at around 4.73. But we think hopefully in future generations we can improve that. So with that, I'd like to conclude by reiterating that I was able to make this new material. I didn't say this before, but this is the first N=3 lead iodide perovskite ever reported. We were able to test the humidity stability of this material, and we show that it is much more robust when you expose it to a controlled humidity environment compared to the 3D perovskite. But also, putting it in a device, it performs very well, especially as a first-generation material, getting almost 5% efficient conversion of the solar energy. So with that, I'd like to thank GCEP for letting me speak today, and for funding. I'd like to thank my PI, Hema, everyone in our group, but specifically Diego, Emma, and Matt for their help on this project, and then Professor Michael McGee, and then his group, specifically Eric, William, and Gray. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Did you make more than one of these devices?
Yeah. I made a fairly large batch, a couple different batches, but close to maybe like 20 cells, devices.
Of each one?
So the illuminated area is around 0.12 square centimeters. The full devices are closer to like 1.5 square centimeters.
Okay. And did all of them show the behavior that you showed in the IV curve? That is, the point below the fitted line, just below VOC, max power voltage?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to talk about this, but these devices are very hysteretic in the JV curves. So if you measure one direction versus another, you'll get a different JV curve. So I've tried to correct for that by doing very slow measurements, essentially holding at 1 voltage, measuring the current until it levels off, and then moving on. In this case, I did do that, but I didn't hold it for long enough at those near the max power point, and so it didn't level off completely, so that it's not exactly the current that you would actually get at that voltage. Most of the devices that I did make did show that, though.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ian, I'm just wondering, from the absorption, can you estimate the relative abundance of the impurity n equals 1, equals 2, and 4 phases? And then can you get some sense of the average domain size of the n equals 3 from the X-ray? Because in your cartoon, it seemed to imply that you just had you had n equals 3, and then n equals 1 impurity, and then n equals 3, and then another impurity. I guess the alternative would be that you have very large n equal 3 domains, and then a region where it's 1, 4, 2, where all of your impurities are kind of jammed into one section, and then another large. So I'm just wondering if you can distinguish those.
Yeah, I think it might be possible to quantify it using UV-Vis absorption. We weren't able to do that, especially because those higher n values, even starting with n equals 3, are not very well characterized. The literature of the n equals 1 and 2 is fairly well known, more n equals 1 than n equals 2. But there are absorption spectra of pure n equals 1 material and 2 reported. The larger n values, it's really hard to make them in pure phase. We were able to crystallize the n equals 3, but in fairly small amounts and not really enough to do many quantitative measurements on. I think powder X-ray diffraction to get the domain size of the n equals 3 would also be possible, but it's very difficult, mostly because you have to form these as films. I have done some larger films that I've been able to scrape into a powder, which is essentially the only way to get a completely unoriented scan. However, it's just hard to get enough material to get a nice scan. I think one of the better powder X-rays I've gotten from these materials was a really long overnight scan on a very small amount of powder. I think potentially, but we weren't able to.
Do you think it matters with respect to your device performance?
I think it does, definitely. I think we're stunting the VOC of this material, or sorry, these devices, because we have those lower energy materials in there, the impurity phases. If we had exclusively n equals 3, I think we would be able to bump the VOC up quite a bit. I think the current density, I don't really know if that would be affected too much, because we might see a loss in current density possibly from those lower energy materials, which might actually have better carrier transport. But yeah, we don't know for sure. I think it's possible that we would increase or decrease that. I don't know.
Cool. How much does the series resistance increase from the bulk to your layered 3, like 3-layer structure?
The 3D perovskite, are you talking about the 3D perovskites?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those devices, most people can make them such that the series resistance is pretty small. I don't make those devices. I don't think I've ever made a complete device out of that material.
Does your cross-plane connectivity decrease because you're basically cutting off the conduction pathways?
Yeah, we do think we are limiting the current or the mobility in that direction specifically. I did collect an EQE spectrum and an IQE, and we do know that we're not getting all the carriers out that we generate, and we think that's probably because of the limited carrier mobility. So yeah, I think it's coming from that, likely.